Hello, folks. What I'm going to do with chapter 2 is I'm going to do it in two set parts to see if people prefer it in split into two parts or whether they prefer it in one continuous full video. Because this is also going to be 13 pages. So, so on with the show. The Great Tara Warrior, Chapter 2, The Adventure Begins. For Barry, once he had finished materialising on the ship, it was as if someone had suddenly turned the lights back on. And for a brief moment, he was unable to bring himself to move. That was until he finally managed to pluck up the courage to open his eyes. And once he did, he was pleased as well as a little relieved to find that he was not dead after all. Once Barry accepted the fact that he was not dead, his next thoughts were that this could not be real, and everything he had experienced so far was nothing more than a really bad dream, which he was still having. Next, he asked himself why was he having such a strange dream, and on deciding that it was because of the large amounts of alcohol and chicken curry that he had eaten the night before, he promised himself that he would not do that again. Then, as an afterthought, he laughed and said, well, maybe not the curry. The more he thought about it, the more he started to realise that he could not possibly be dreaming, because if he was, then he would not feel as bad as he did. So having come to the conclusion that he was not dreaming, he continued to lay there for a few moments longer, staring up at the ceiling until the feeling of being sick started to pass. At which point he raised himself up onto his elbows and started to take in his surroundings. And as he did so, the feeling of being sick was replaced with a feeling of dizziness. But after a few moments, this feeling of dizziness also started to subside. And as he fully regained his balance, he gingerly raised himself up further into a sitting position. And it was at this point that Barry started to study the room he was in more closely. As he did so, he quickly realised that not only was he not having a really bad dream, but he was also not at home in his own bed either. But he was in fact in some kind of room with brilliant white tiled walls, just like the ones you might find in a bathroom. Plus, after getting himself into a sitting position with his legs stretched out in front of him, he could see that he was sitting on what appeared to be a shiny black padded bench about the size of a single bed. As he waited for the feeling of dizziness to subside completely, he continued to sit there, swinging his legs and tapping the side of the bench with his heels. And as he did so, to his surprise, he noticed that he was no longer wearing the same clothes which he had been wearing when he left the house that morning. But instead, he was now dressed in a completely different set of clothes, which he knew were not his own, as he had never seen them before. These consisted of a two-piece shiny suit whose design reminded Barry of those Kevlar suits you often see in sci-fi pictures. Also, as well as the suit, he was wearing a pair of close-fitting boots which came up to approximately 11 centimetres above his ankles. And unlike what you would expect with boots, they were flat with no heels, which was probably why they seemed to hug his feet like a glove. Also, as Barry looked closer at this outfit, he could not find any visible form of fastenings to either the suit or the boots. In fact, it was as if the suit had been designed to fit him perfectly, and the boots had been moulded directly onto his feet. Both the suit top and the suit bottom were the same dark blue in colour, although the suit bottom had a green stripe down the outside of each leg. The boots, on the other hand, were a rich burgundy in colour. Another thing Barry noticed was that neither the suit nor the boots displayed any symbols or badges of any kind. Looking more closely at what he was now wearing, Barry realised that both the suit and the boots were made from a material which he did not recognise, while at the same time he was amazed at just how soft to the touch this material was. And also it was that light that he felt as if he wasn't wearing anything at all. And as I say, even though the suit had been designed to be a perfect fit, it was nonetheless not that tight. Therefore, nothing was showing that should not have been showing, if you know what I mean. As Barry looked around the room, he could, on closer inspection, see that the walls were not as white as he had first thought them to be, but they were in fact what you would call off-white. The floor, on the other hand, was light grey in colour, and it had two green stripes about 10 centimetres in width running around the edge of the room. The room was about 6 metres wide and 15 metres in length, and 3 of its walls were straight, but the fourth wall, which was at the opposite end of the room to the bench, had 2 alcoves built into it, one each side of a central pillar, giving it the appearance of a Victorian fireplace, similar to what you might find in a house built in the early part of the 20th century. From his position on the bench, Barry was able to estimate that the height of the room from floor to ceiling was approximately 5 metres, and the ceiling was the same colour as the walls. He further noticed that there were no markings or decorations of any kind on either the walls or the ceiling. Plus, try as he might, he could not work out how the room was being illuminated, as he could not see any light fittings either hanging from the ceilings or on the walls. Nor could he see any way of turning the lights on and off, although he thought that it was possible that the lights might be voice activated. Yet despite this lack of evidence of an internal lighting system, the room was still as bright as day. However, that being said, the light was not too bright, but was instead what you might call a warm light. While Barry continued studying his new surroundings, he slowly slid his body forward until his feet were fully touching the floor. And with his feet firmly touching the floor, he thought about standing up. And while he was deciding whether to stand up or not, his attention was drawn to the fact that this bench was not the only piece of furniture in the room. He could see that in the centre of the left-hand alcove was a high-back padded chair which was facing into the room, and which at first glance appeared to Barry to be made from the same black padded material as was the bench he was sitting on. Also, to the right of the chair, attached to the wall by 2 ornate silver brackets, was a small table, and which Barry estimated was approximately 1 metre from the floor. As well as this table and chair, there was also what appeared to be a small rectangular mirror hanging on the wall between the 2 alcoves. But as Barry looked at it more closely, he wondered if it really was a mirror, because he was unable to see his reflection. He also noticed that another feature of the room was that it was windowless, and try as he might, he could not find any evidence of a doorway, so naturally he wondered how he had gotten into the room in the first place. But even more importantly, he started to wonder how he was going to get out again. After spending a few more minutes thinking about how he was going to get out of the room, Barry finally decided to get off the bench and take a walk around to see if he could find a way out which he was unable to see from his current position. Therefore, with this in mind, he finally raised himself up to a standing position. And as he did so, he was a little surprised at just how easily he was able to achieve this simple act of standing. The reason for his surprise was because he had been suffering from prostate cancer for the past 3 years, and unfortunately by the time it was diagnosed it was too late to cure. And as the cancer had over the past couple of months started to get worse, he was now finding this simple act of getting to his feet somewhat harder to achieve. A fact he had kept from Holly and his friends, I should add, although naturally he had told Adele. After getting over his surprise, Barry quickly put the matter out of his mind and started to investigate the room more fully. And as he did so, it suddenly dawned on him that not only had he been able to get off the bench much more easier than would normally have been the case, but as he moved about the room, he realised how good he was now feeling in himself, and that all the aches and pains that he suffered from were now gone. He was also surprised at how quickly he had gotten over the feeling of being sick, as well as the feeling of dizziness, because after all, he had just been ripped apart and put back together again, so to speak. After spending several minutes walking around the room, checking out its 3 straight walls to see if he could find any sign of a concealed doorway, he came to the conclusion that there wasn't one. So he next decided to investigate the 2 alcoves to see if there was a hidden doorway in either one of them. And as he entered the first alcove, he knew that if he failed to find a doorway in either of the alcoves, then he could well be stuck in this room forever. However, he quickly put this thought out of his mind. After checking out the first alcove and failing to find any sign of a doorway, he tried to contain his disappointment as he moved on to check out the second alcove. And as he passed from one alcove to the other, he got a closer look at what he had first thought to be a mirror. And as he did so, he realised that it was not the simple mirror he took it to be. And what led him to this conclusion was because instead of his reflection, which he had expected to see, all he saw was a silver sheen in the middle of a frame. As he looked at the screen, he thought of the mirror scene in Snow White, and so with a laugh he started to say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall." But even before he had uttered the second word, the screen changed into a perfect mirror, and so for the first time he got a glimpse of his reflection. And as he did so, he was rather surprised at what he saw, because as he looked at his reflection, he realised he was not wearing his glasses, something he had not thought about until now. And the reason why I was surprised was because even when he was a much younger man, he had poor eyesight, and so he had to wear glasses. And now he was older, he was almost blind in his left eye without his glasses. But now his eyesight appeared to be perfect. As he thought about this, it suddenly struck him like a thunderbolt that as well as not wearing glasses, the reflection in the mirror was not his own. And so he quickly turned round to see if anyone was standing behind him. And finding that no one was, his mind seemed to fog over as he tried to comprehend just what it was he was looking at. Of course, there was no disputing the fact that it was himself who was looking in the mirror. But what was surprising, and a little scary I might add, was that the person looking back at him was not him, so to speak, in that the person in the reflection, although looking like him, to a certain degree, was not him as he looked now, but was that of a much younger person. And as he looked closer, he decided, as impossible as it seemed, the reflection was of him when he was in his early to mid-20s. As Barry continued studying this reflection of a younger version of himself, he could not help but say, "My God, Barry, you old son of a gun. No wonder you never had a problem finding a girlfriend in those days." And for a few brief moments, a smile spread across his face as his thoughts drifted back to the far-off days of his youth. Unlike this older self, however, His younger version had a full head of long, dark brown hair, and he also could not help but notice that he still had those same deep blue eyes with that same twinkle, as well as the same confident look on his face that I always seemed to have in his youth. According to his friends, that was, and especially his girlfriends, of which there had been many in those far-off days, as he often used to refer to his past as whenever he was reminiscing about his youth. As Barry stood there transfixed by what he was seeing in the mirror, while at the same time admiring his new look and trying to work out what the hell was going on, he suddenly noticed from the reflection that there was now a body on the bench which moments earlier he had been sitting on. And as his brain registered the existence of this body, he wondered why he had not noticed it as he was walking round the room. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he was that the reason why he had not noticed it before was because it had not been there before, and therefore it had to have appeared while he was in the alcove. Once over the shock of this new development, Barry turned round to get a better look at this body, and as he did so, he became a little confused, because there on the bench was not just any body, but it was the body of his older self, still dressed in the same clothes that he had been wearing when he left the house that morning. As Barry stood there desperately trying to make sense of what it was he was looking at, he started to think that this had to be an hallucination, and if it was not, then it had to be a really bad nightmare, or even worse, he really was dead and he was now in hell. Once he thought about it logically, he came to the only conclusion possible, which was that none of these options were true. Therefore, what was happening to him was real, and so this body on the bench was also real. And as this realization struck him, his world once again started to go black, and as he slowly slid to the floor, his last thoughts were, "Oh my God, somehow I must have had a full body transplant." Although to Barry it only seemed like a few seconds, it was in fact some 10 minutes later before he eventually regained consciousness, and as the world finally came back into focus, he took a few moments to gather his thoughts before he gingerly picked himself up off the floor. Now, having fully regained his composure, he cautiously approached the bench so as to get a better look at this body, which he still could not accept was the body of his older self. And as he moved closer, he carefully stretched out his left hand and gently touched the body on the temple. As he did so, he cried out in alarm and took a step backwards, and the reason for his cry of alarm was that the body was still warm to the touch. And after further inspecting the body, and despite not being able to detect a pulse, he concluded that this body must still be alive. How can this be, he thought, looking down at the bench, as if he half expected his older self to tell him what was going on. And it was at this point that mental fatigue started to set in, and he decided that he needed to sit down. Of course, the bench was out of the question, so he walked over to the right-hand alcove and sat down on the small chair, and once seated, he again started to look around the room. And for the first time since he found himself in this strange place, he spoke out loud, saying, "Just what the hell is going on?" Naturally, he was not expecting to get an answer to his question, so you can imagine just how surprised he was when a warm and friendly female voice said, "You are being taken to the planet Jumaine to defend its people against an invasion by a race known as the Brutalis, who have come from the planet Doomstone." At the sudden sound of this unknown female voice, Barry said with a loud shriek, "Who's there? Show yourself!" jumping up from the chair, while at the same time looking for the source of the voice. And as he did so, he quickly realised that the voice had to be coming from the small screen which hung between the two alcoves, and which had now changed from a mirror to a computer screen. Although this break in the silence had at first made Barry jump a little, well, quite a lot actually, nonetheless he quickly put his embarrassment behind him and stepped out of the alcove to check out the screen, and for a brief moment he froze before returning back to the alcove and slumping back down into the chair. The reason for his shock was because of what he had seen on the screen, which was the face of his old girlfriend Lucy, who he had last seen approximately 33 years ago. Barry had first met Lucy in November of '98 in the sleepy village of Hansgate, while they were working together at the Red Lion Hotel, and they had instantly become friends. Yet it wasn't until late July of the following year that their relationship developed beyond mere friendship and they started to become more intimate. It was at that point that they decided that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together, and so on an impulse they left the hotel in the middle of the night and moved to the city of Leeds, where they made a home together until late January of 2002. Sadly for Barry, this relationship only lasted these 2.5 years because one day Lucy, as usual, set off for work and was never seen again, or at least not by anyone on earth, that was. Yet despite her disappearance and everyone telling him she had probably left him for another man, he refused to accept this, telling anyone who would listen that this idea was completely impossible, and even after all these years he still had not got over her loss. As Barry tried to pull himself together, another much larger screen suddenly appeared on the wall of the alcove, and that face of Lucy once again appeared and continued speaking in those same warm tones, saying, "Please do not be afraid, Barry," and after a further pause went on to say, "While you were unconscious, I was able to probe your mind and found this image which I am now using to communicate with you." The voice went on to say, "I am the ship's computer Zargon, but I can answer to any name or use any other image which you might find more preferable to this one." She then went on to say that as well as changing the image, she could also change the voice if he found the current one not to his liking, to which Barry, having recovered from his initial shock, said, "Interesting. I will have to think about that." Naturally, Barry had to think about this because, after all, he had been fortunate enough to have not one, but 5 great loves in his life. These being Lucy, Laura, Adele, Hermione, and Holly. Not necessarily in that order, you understand. So selecting an image from these 5 people was not going to be an easy task. Therefore, after thinking about it for several moments, Barry told the computer that he had decided to stick with its choice of image and went on to say that he would like her to answer to the name of Lucy, and he would call her by this name whenever he was communicating with her. He also told her that he would like her to continue using the same voice which she was currently using. Of course, the real reason why he had gone with the computer's choice rather than making one of his own was because it made him feel easier in his mind that he had not picked one of his loves over the other 4. In other words, it eased his conscience, which is not a bad thing considering the circumstances. Before Lucy could respond to Barry's request, he went on to say, "I want you to tell me in complete detail why I'm on board this ship and what has been done to me since I was brought on board." And again, before Lucy could respond, he pointed in the direction of the bench and said, "Starting with why there is a replica of me on that bench." In response, Lucy spent the next hour or so answering all his questions, of which he had many. She started by explaining that the body on the bench was not a replica of him, but was in fact his own earthly body. And before Barry could ask her what did she mean by this, she had already gone on to explain the reason why he was on board, which was so he could be taken to Lucy's home planet called Germain, which is located in the outer edge of the Dragon Galaxy. But to get to Germain, you have to use the taxon wormhole. However, to reach the taxon wormhole, you first have to pass through the great expanse known as the Gorman Nebula. While Barry was still processing this information, Lucy went on to say that the problem with this plan was that as she probed his mind, along with the personal stuff, such as the image of the person he calls Lucy, she also discovered that his human body was not capable of surviving the radiation that is known to be generated by the Praxis star, located at the centre of the nebula, with the result that he will have died long before he got anywhere near the taxon wormhole, let alone Germain. Stunned at this information, Barry took a deep breath and said, "If that's the case, Lucy, then what was the point of you coming to Earth if the trip back is going to kill me?" To which Lucy explained that although she had been aware of the radiation before she left Germain, she did not know of his body's vulnerability to the radiation until she had been able to study his human physiology more closely. However, once she realized it was going to be a problem, she transferred his consciousness from his human body into the android body which he now inhabited, and she had done this knowing that unlike his old human body, this new android body is capable of surviving the trip without suffering any ill effects from the radiation. And as she finished explaining this, Barry once again found himself trying to get over yet another shock. Once he got over this new shock, he held his hands out in front of him and turned them over a number of times, as if he expected to see some kind of a mechanical claw. And on seeing that they looked just like his normal hands, he shook his head several times from side to side and stood up and, looking directly at the screen, gave a nervous laugh and said, rather forcefully I might add, "I don't bloody believe it. You have got to be joking." To which Lucy simply replied, "No, I am not." After this outburst by Barry, everything went silent, as if the computer was waiting for his next response, which in turn gave Barry the chance to calm down. Now feeling a lot calmer, he asked Lucy if there was no other way of getting to Germain, as he did not like the idea of being turned into a machine. To which Lucy said that if he hoped to arrive in time to be of any use to the people of Germain, then regrettably they had to go through the Gorman Nebula, adding that she would like to point out that being in this android body did not make him a machine. In fact, he was still the same person he had always been, except now he was no longer made of flesh and blood. Barry's next question was what was his family and friends going to think when he did not return from his walk. After all, he did not want them to think he had deserted them. In response, Lucy went on to explain that this would not happen because his human body was to be placed back on the planet's surface at the same spot where he had been taken from earlier that morning, and in such a condition that it would leave the authorities to conclude that he had died in some kind of a freak accident, and so as a result his family and friends would not, as he said, think he had deserted them. Barry thought about what Lucy had said for a moment before asking her what kind of accident did she have in mind, quickly adding that the police on his planet were no fools and that they would surely investigate further to find out what had happened to him. And even if the police decided that he had died in a freak accident, his family and friends would want to know a lot more about the circumstances of such an accident before they accepted what had happened to him was indeed just a freak accident and nothing more sinister. Lucy said that she had anticipated this and therefore intended to take full advantage of the large thunderstorm approaching the location where he had previously been sitting. She said that she had calculated that in the next 5 minutes it would be at its most severe, producing many lightning strikes, and at that precise moment his original body would be electrocuted before being placed back on the bench where he had been sitting, and in this way, when the body was discovered, the authorities would conclude that he had been struck many times by the lightning, which in turn had caused him to have a severe failure of the heart, resulting in his untimely death. Nodding, Barry said, "You seem to have it all worked out then," at which point he left the alcove and moved back to the centre of the room to face the image on the other screen between the alcoves, and as he did so, he was aware of a flash of bright light behind him, and when he turned around, he found that his whole body was no longer there, and the bench had also disappeared along with it. After a moment's pause, Barry sighed as if he had just lost an old friend, and as he turned back to face the image, he felt a slight tremor, but thought nothing of it. Instead, he said that he assumed he was no longer on the shuttlecraft, which he had first encountered that morning, but was now on the main ship itself, to which Lucy confirmed that his assumption was correct. She went on to explain that the slight tremor he had just felt was the ship accelerating away from the planet, leaving it far behind them. After a moment's pause, Barry said, "You are forgetting one thing." "And what is that?" asked Lucy. "What if I do not want to go? Do you intend to force me to go?" Lucy said she did not need to because the Mymitech elders had anticipated this problem when they built the ship, and so the builders had fitted the Germain Defender with the ability to time travel, so that after completing his mission, he could return to the planet at the exact moment in time as when he had left it. That way, no one would ever know he had left the planet in the first place. After a moment's pause, Lucy went on to say that if the Mymitech elders were wrong to believe that once he became aware of the ship's ability to time travel, he would want to go on to Germain, then she would of course return him to the planet. But before he made his decision on whether or not to return to the planet, he should understand that the transfer of his consciousness to this android body was now irreversible, because the action of electrocuting his earthly body had destroyed a large part of the brain as well as the heart and lungs. Therefore, after taking a moment to think about this new information and realizing that there was now no turning back, he told Lucy that he had decided to go on to Germain instead of returning to Earth. And as he made his commitment to go, his sense of adventure once again started to take over, even as the feeling he needed to sit down returned. As the bench was no longer available, Barry returned to the alcove, and after turning the chair so it faced the screen, he sat down, and once seated, he asked Lucy to describe the ship in greater detail, starting with how many rooms the ship had and what were their functions. In response, Lucy said that the ship consisted of 25 decks, and 2 of these decks were the hangar decks where the shuttles could enter and leave the ship. She went on to say that the ship had 6 functional areas, such as the engineering department, and each of these functional areas had its own control room. Also, there was 354 other types of room for such things as resting, entertainment, cargo and health. And as well as these rooms, there was a large armoury on deck 5. When Lucy finished describing these other parts of the ship, Barry went on to say that he assumed that as well as the room she had just described, there was also a main bridge. And again, Lucy confirmed that his assumption was correct. "Good," said Barry, and went on to ask Lucy the obvious question of how he could get there from his present location. In answer to his question, Lucy explained that there were several methods of reaching the bridge from his location, such as the turbo lift system or the central stairway. However, the quickest method would be to use the internal teleport system. After spending a moment thinking about which one of these options he was going to take, he said, "Suppose I do not want to use the internal teleport system, but want to use one of the other methods. How can I leave this room, as it does not appear to have a doorway?" To which Lucy replied that there was a doorway, and as she said this, a section of the back wall to the right of the room seemed to melt away, and an opening appeared, giving access to a brightly lit passageway. Although Barry was not too keen on the idea of using the teleport system, as he had not as yet fully recovered mentally from his first experience of the system, he did nonetheless, after thinking about it for a few moments, decide that it was, after all, the quickest method of reaching the bridge. So he instructed Lucy to teleport him directly there, and so seconds later he found himself covered in a beam of bright light, and his world once again seemed to melt away. However, the sensation only lasted a few seconds before he materialized again, and this time, to his relief, he suffered none of the discomforts he had suffered when he was teleported on board the ship. As Barry's vision returned to normal, he looked around the room, which he assumed was the bridge, and he could see that it was quite spacious and appeared to be oval in shape. The room had a large viewing screen which covered approximately half the forward wall, extending out from the centre of the room. And to the rear of the room there were several banks of workstations, with each one being covered from top to bottom with numerous sets of switches, brightly lit dials and flashing lights, and each station had its own smaller work screen. In the dim light of the bridge, Barry could just make out what appeared to be two sliding doorways, one of which was on the far left of the bridge and the other was on the far right of the bridge. And these two doorways were approximately 2 meters tall and 1.5 meters wide, and were of a dark green colour, which made them stand out against the cream colour of the rest of the bridge.